Meet King Ludwig II, the last king of Bavaria. Now, this guy wasn't your average ruler. Oh no, this man was a collector of oddities. He assembled a personal army of over 13,000 men solely for the purpose of protecting his art collection. That's more bodyguards than most nations have in an entire military. That's not even the half of it. When you stepped into his royal bathroom, you'd think you'd entered a high-end perfume store. Why? Well, Ludwig kept hundreds of different kinds of perfume, dousing himself in layers of fragrance throughout the day. Some say he smelled like lilacs in old books. Others claim he reeked of stale waste and decay. And let's talk about his diet. This king loved his sweets, especially marzipan. It was said that during his lifetime he ate enough of this stuff to fill 5 elephants. But if you really wanted to know what made Ludwig tick, you'd have to look at his bedroom. Every night before bed, he'd don a pair of heavy velvet slippers, which he then proceeded to kiss passionately. Talk about getting a little handsy. No, seriously, he'd repeatedly smash the toes of his slippers together until he drew blood. And as if that wasn't weird enough, after he fell ill with pneumonia in 1842, he decided that sleeping in a coffin would cure him. Yeah, you heard me right, a coffin. He had one custom made for himself, lined with silk and fitted with a glass panel. Then he promptly spent several weeks sleeping in it every night. Did it work? Who knows? But here's the kicker. After he kicked the bucket in 1866, he was actually buried in that same coffin. Now that's what I call commitment. But wait, there's more. Meet King George III of England, a man so enamored with farming that he once talked for 58 hours straight about the finer points of planting potatoes. Yep, you heard me right, 58 hours. Talk about a rooting toot and good time. But George's love of agriculture didn't stop there. Designed an entire farm complete with manicured hedges in the shape of Greek letters and buildings named after biblical figures. Who wouldn't want to pay a visit to the Old Testament farm? But George's strange relationship with the countryside didn't end at his property line. He was obsessed with deer to the point of insanity. Once he even chased a deer through the streets of London, causing utter pandemonium. But George's fascination with the fauna didn't stop at deer. He created an entire deer park on Windsor Heath, complete with a lodge, stables, gardens, and a grotto. He also employed a team of artists to paint over 200 portraits of deer. Seriously, the guy was like a real-life Walter White, except instead of meth, he was cooking up deer fever. Let's not forget about King Charles II of England. You know, the guy who famously had an affair with a milkmaid while in exile in Normandy? Well, Charles loved that milkmaid so much that he brought a whole herd of Jersey cows with him back too. England in 1660? Talk about a bovine bonanza. But Charles's animal obsession didn't stop there. He had a soft spot for cats, keeping a clouder of them in his palace. And don't even get me started on his fascination with fashion. Charles II was a true peacock, always decked out in the latest styles. Even if they were a little, shall we say, out there. Remember that time he showed up to Parliament wearing a hat made of a fish? Or how about the time he sported a coat with a hood lined with the pelts of black cats? Classy, huh? But hey, when you're the king, you can wear whatever you want. So there you have it, folks. Just a small sampling of the weirdest kings in history. Now it's your turn. Which of these royal oddballs was the most fascinating, and why? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the bizarre and the historical. Thanks for watching. In the grand theater of history, kings are often portrayed as larger-than-life figures. Their decisions echo through the ages, their faces adorn currency, and their legacies are debated for centuries. But what if we told you that behind the opulence and regality, these men harbored secrets? Peculiar habits that, in another time, might have seen them branded as eccentrics rather than royalty. Join us as we pull back the velvet curtains and unveil the surprising quirks that made these kings truly unique. His Majesty, King Henry VIII of England. King Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 wives, his break with the Catholic Church, and his ruthless command of power. But behind the throne was a man with obsessions that bordered on the absurd. Paranoid about illness, he surrounded himself with scented cloths, soaked in vinegar and herbs, convinced they would purify the air and shield him from disease. He refused to drink plain water, relying entirely on ale and wine, believing that boiling or fermenting was the only way to make it safe. Yet the strangest of his habits was how he tested loyalty. Those in his favor were expected to indulge his every whim, no matter how irrational, from orchestrating elaborate feasts where exotic animals were roasted whole. 2 jousting tournaments staged not for honor, but for his personal amusement. As his body deteriorated from injury and infection, Henry would sit alone in vast, dimly lit halls, the air heavy with candle smoke. Servants reported hearing him whisper to the flickering shadows, as if holding counsel with invisible advisers. Some swore he was speaking to the ghosts of those he had executed wives. Ministers, friends bargaining with them in the silence of the night, His Imperial Majesty, Peter the Great of Russia. If Henry VIII was a tyrant, Peter the Great was an enigma. Towering and restless, Peter was fascinated by all things foreign, embracing new technologies and Western customs. But he also possessed an unsettling fascination with the grotesque. Dentistry became one of his strangest obsessions. He carried pliers with him at all times and would offer to extract teeth from anyone he met, whether they needed it or not. Friends, courtiers, and even strangers found themselves leaving the Tsar's presence missing a tooth, which he would then add to his growing collection in. Bizarre treasury he proudly displayed. His curiosity for the macabre extended to his infamous cabinet of curiosities, where severed heads preserved in jars sat alongside exotic artifacts. To Peter, these gruesome objects were symbols of power, proof that he could command both life and death. His drinking sessions were legendary, often ending with guests forced to join him in increasingly strange games that blurred the line between revelry and cruelty. In Egypt, centuries later, King Farouk reigned in an age of radio, automobiles, and international diplomacy, but his habits would have shamed even the most decadent monarchs of the past. He was a compulsive hoarder and thief, pocketing trinkets from guests, and even lifting a watch from Winston Churchill. Farouk's appetite was legendary. He would feast deep into the night, often ordering dozens of dishes at once, from pyramids of pastries to entire platters of roasted pigeons. His private chambers smelled of tobacco and rich food, with silk sheets often stained from the remnants of midnight meals. But beneath the indulgence was a streak of superstition. He believed dreams could predict the future, and would wake in the small hours to record them in a leather-bound journal, convinced that they contained messages about his reign. Court gossip whispered of nights when Farouk would summon his most trusted servants simply to read these dreams aloud, demanding their interpretation as though they were divine prophecies. His Royal Highness, King Sigmund of Sweden. Not all eccentric kings lived in grand excess. King Sigismund of Sweden's habits were rooted in a suffocating need for cleanliness and order. He forbade anyone from touching him with bare hands. Servants were required to wear gloves at all times, and even his personal physician could only examine him through layers of cloth. His food was inspected and tasted multiple times before it reached him, and he was known to delay entire councils until he had completed his daily ritual of inspecting his own reflection for signs of illness. This ritual could last hours, as he studied his face under different lighting, turning from mirror to mirror, searching for blemishes or discolorations that might signal the onset of disease. To outsiders, it was the behavior of a man crippled by paranoia. To Sigismund, it was simply the diligence of a ruler determined to preserve his life at all costs. His Majesty, King Umberto II of Italy. If Sigmund was consumed by the microscopic, Umberto was paralyzed by the unknown. He believed certain numbers held power over fate, and he would refuse to make political decisions or attend events on days he considered unlucky. His clothing often had small charms sewn into the lining, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Each one chosen for a specific protection, against betrayal, against illness, against assassination. But perhaps his most unsettling fascination was with doubles, people who looked eerily like him. He sought them out across the country, inviting them to dine in secret. He claimed that their presence confused potential assassins, and that, by having them near, he could divert danger away from himself. Some whispered that on certain public occasions it was not the king who appeared at all, but one of these doubles, smiling and waving while the real Umberto watched from a hidden vantage point. His Majesty, King Ludwig of Hungary. And finally, among this gallery of strange rulers, there was King Ludwig of Hungary, whose life was dictated by silence. He could not bear the sound of footsteps in his palace, and so thick carpets were laid in every corridor to muffle them. Servants were forbidden to speak in his presence unless he addressed them directly, and musicians were ordered to play without looking at him. His meals were taken alone in heavily curtained rooms where even the clinking of silverware seemed sacrilegious. Yet Ludwig's love of silence was counterbalanced by an equally intense fascination with sudden noise. Without warning, he would shatter the stillness of the night by firing pistols into the air, delighting in the terror it caused. To him, the contrast between quiet and chaos was not merely dramatic, it was a kind of art, a reminder of the fragility of order in a world where disorder could erupt at any moment. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to be the first to know when new videos are released. The weight of a crown often presses hardest in the private hours. Those long stretches, when the court is silent and the ruler is left alone with his own mind. For some kings, that solitude was fertile ground for obsession. And for King Charles II of Spain, it became a breeding ground for fears so consuming they bordered on the supernatural. Born into the most inbred branch of the Habsburg dynasty, Charles was physically frail and mentally unwell from birth. He convinced himself that his body was cursed, the victim of some ancient sorcery placed upon his bloodline. His bedchambers were filled with relics and holy objects, from splinters of the true cross to vials of miracle water gathered from distant shrines. He refused to bathe in ordinary water, insisting that it be blessed by priests before it touched his skin. Even meals had to be blessed twice, once before preparation and again before they were set before him. Late at night, he would summon monks to perform exorcisms on him, murmuring prayers while holding sacred relics against his chest, hoping they might draw the imagined curse out of his flesh. Far from Spain, in the frozen reaches of Russia, Tsar Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, ruled with a combination of brutal violence and personal ritual. Ivan's moods were as unpredictable as the winter storms that swept across his empire. In moments of calm, he would spend hours in private chapels, chanting prayers in a low, rhythmic voice, sometimes falling into a trance. But these moments of peace were deceptive. He had a habit of keeping lists-long, meticulous records of perceived enemies, detailing their supposed crimes and the punishments they would suffer. These lists were often updated daily, sometimes more than once, and no one was ever entirely sure when they had fallen into or out of favor. Ivan also maintained a collection of staffs carved from exotic woods, each topped with an ornate metal head. These were not ceremonial objects he would lean on them as he walked, but in sudden fits of rage, he used them as weapons, striking servants or boyars without warning. Those who survived such attacks took them as a grim blessing, for many others did not. In the French court, in the reign of King Francis I, was a place of spectacle and refinement. But Francis himself had a private fascination with the human body that bordered on the morbid, known for his love of art and culture. He was equally interested in anatomies, so much so that he maintained a small theater in the palace where dissections were performed before select audiences. He believed that understanding the body was key to understanding the soul, and he often invited artists and scientists to observe the proceedings. But whispers spread that Francis did not merely attend these sessions, he participated in them, personally handling the instruments, leaning in to study the intricate structure of veins and muscles. To his admirers, it was the curiosity of a Renaissance mind. To his detractors, it was an unseemly obsession with the inner workings of the dead. In Denmark, King Christian IV was famous for his wars, his architectural projects, but in his private life. He was marked by a habit that astonished even his closest advisors. He was obsessed with disguises, often wandering the streets of Copenhagen dressed as a commoner. But unlike monarchs who did this to hear the voice of the people, Christian's aim was stranger. He sought out taverns and low houses, not to gather intelligence, but to engage in competitions of drinking and games of chance with total strangers. There were tales of the king sitting in the corner of a smoky room, playing cards into the early morning hours, revealing his identity only when a quarrel broke out, or when his companions were too drunk to stand. Some say he used these excursions to test the loyalty of his guards. Others that he simply craved the thrill of moving unseen among those who would never expect to be in the company of a king. Across the Mediterranean, in the court of Naples, King Ferdinand I, known as Ferrante, developed a habit that chilled even the most hardened courtiers. He loved hunting, not just for sport but as a means of political theater. Enemies who displeased him were sometimes invited on hunts, only to vanish in the forests. Yet, perhaps more unsettling was what he did afterward. Ferrante kept a secret chamber in his palace, where the bodies of his enemies were preserved. Clad in fine clothing and posed in lifelike positions, they were arranged as though still in conversation. A grotesque gallery of those who had crossed him. He would visit this room in moments of reflection, walking among the corpses as if conferring with his most trusted advisors. Those who knew of the chamber understood the message clearly. Defiance against the king would not only end one's life, but one's memory would be frozen forever in his macabre collection. Further north, in England, King George III's habits took a different shape. Before his well-known bouts of madness, George was a man of peculiar routines. He insisted on rising at the same early hour every day, regardless of illness or weather, and began each morning by inspecting the palace gardens himself. But his most curious habit was his obsession with agricultural experiments. He would spend hours speaking to farmers, examining new breeds of livestock, and even personally attempting to crossbreed plants. These experiments were not limited to the fields. George had certain foods prepared in unusual combinations, convinced that they might lead to improved health or even extended life. He meticulously recorded the results in a private journal, treating each meal as though it were a royal decree in itself. Servants often joked that the king's dining room was less a table than a laboratory, though few dared say so within earshot of the monarch. These kings ruled lands vast and small, their names etched into the chronicles of history. But in the quiet corners of their lives, in the rituals and fascinations that filled the hours unseen by their subjects, their humanity was revealed not in acts of mercy or grandeur, but in obsessions that bound them as tightly as any chain. To understand them fully is to walk not in their public halls of power, but through the locked doors where their strangest selves lived, breathing in the shadows. These are the secret histories of kings, not as conquerors or lawmakers, but as prisoners of their own making. When King Philip V of Spain lost his first wife, his mind fragmented. Some days he couldn't get out of bed. Other days he paced like a caged animal. The courtiers didn't know what to make of it. They watched as the once vibrant monarch withered beneath the weight of his grief. Then came the music. From the depths of his bedchamber, he would summon the court singer Farinelli to perform. At first, it was a variety of songs, but soon he requested only mournful arias. For hours, Farinelli would sing of lost love and unrequited longing, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. Slowly, the king's agitated breaths would turn to soft snores. The music was a lullaby, a balm for the troubled king. If it stopped, Philip wouldn't sleep, and without sleep, he grew weaker, wasting away into a melancholic shell. One day, the king lay down and didn't rise. The court physician felt for a pulse, turned to the assembled nobles, and announced, "The king is dead." But as the room filled with wails and lamentations, a small smile touched Philip's lips. He opened his eyes and whispered, "I am not dead. I only feign to be so that I may hear Farinelli sing to me once more." The court froze. Was the king mad? Had he been playing them? Perhaps. But from that day on, Farinelli sang every night before the king, and Philip never quite left his bed again. Across the world in Persia, Shah Abbas, I ruled with an iron fist. He kept his enemies in cages and his rivals in tombs. But his grip on power was matched only by his attention to detail. Every morning the Shah would bathe in rosewater, comb his thick beard into geometric patterns, and adjust his turban to within an inch of its life. He surrounded himself with luxury, trapping the sun's rays in crystal chandeliers, in filling his palace with carpets so thick that courtiers could walk barefoot across them without feeling the stones beneath. But for all his vanity, Abbas had a secret vice. He loved to wander the city in disguise. He would don the clothes of a merchant, drape a veil over his face, and slip out of the palace gates. Sometimes he would travel as far as the suburbs, mingling with commoners and bargaining in bazaars. Once he was spotted arguing with a fruit seller over the price of pomegranates. On another occasion, he was seen buying bread from a street vendor. What possessed him to do this? Was it a desire to live a simple life, a yearning for normalcy, or a thirst for danger? Only Abbas knew. In Spain, King Alfonso XIII sought solace in the flickering light of the cinema. He loved movies, not for their plots or characters, but for the forbidden thrill they offered. While the rest of Europe was catching up to cinema, Spain was still stuck in the age of bullfighting and religious plays. Alfonso did something no one else did. He commissioned his own movies, starring actors who bore little resemblance to real people. He would watch these films with rapt attention, his face illuminated in the darkness. One day, the king was watching a movie he'd produced, featuring two men embracing passionately. Suddenly, a courtier entered the room and stood transfixed by what he saw on the screen. Alfonso quickly pressed the stop button, then turned to the courtier and asked, "What do you think? Is it a convincing portrayal?" The courtier stammered, "Most gracious king." And that was the end of that particular movie. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Ibrahim was already mad, or, as the Ottomans put it, intoxicated with the divine spirit. He threw tantrums, hurled gold coins from his tower, and unleashed poisonous snakes into the audience at the Hippodrome. But his madness had a method. Ibrahim loved two things: power and fur. He draped furs on everything: sofas, pillars, even the heads of his enemies. He lined his chambers with carpets made of lynx, tiger, and panther fur. He commissioned suits of armor covered in mink, each piece tailored to fit perfectly. He was especially fond of one suit, which he wore for hours, slowly turning and twisting in it until it creaked and groaned under the strain. But for all his bluster, Ibrahim had a secret softness. He kept cats. Dozens of them roamed his palace, lounging on velvet cushions and batting at priceless artifacts. Ibrahim doted on them, feeding them from a golden bowl and brushing their fur until it shone like polished mahogany. He would look at them for hours, murmuring, "You are my friends. You are the only ones who understand me." In Poland, King Sigismund Augustus was obsessed with an object, an amber cabinet, massive and intricately carved. It stood in his private chamber, holding his most prized possessions. Every morning the king would wake up and go straight to the cabinet. He would open its doors and gaze at the contents, then close it slowly and walk away. He repeated this ritual every day, never adding anything new and never removing anything old. His counselors noticed his strange behavior and decided to intervene. One day, they snuck into the cabinet and moved a few items around. When the king discovered the next morning that his collection was in disorder, he went wild. He paced his chamber, tore at his clothes, and paced some more. Eventually, he collapsed, muttering, "My cabinet is disturbed. My kingdom is doomed." And indeed, the moves they had made were minor, barely noticeable. To anyone else, but the king never noticed. He spent his last days staring at the cabinet, waiting for the disaster he knew was coming. Whether they were singing arias, handling cabinets, or combing beards, these kings weren't just performing rituals. They were seeking an edge in a world that demanded they always be sharp, always be in control. Behind closed doors, they shed the weight of the crown, revealing the men beneath the throne. Perhaps they hid their obsessions because the mantle of kingship had driven them mad. We may never know. Flickering torchlight of history illuminates some kings as grand silhouettes, warriors, builders, lawmakers. But look closer in the dimmer corners of their private lives and the image shifts. There in the shadows are men driven not only by ambition, but by impulses so strange they defy reason. Consider King Louis XI of France, known as the Spider King, for his tangled webs of intrigue. Louis surrounded himself with astrologers, fortune-tellers, and alchemists. Not as idle amusement, but as essential advisors. He wore small lead amulets around his neck, each engraved with symbols meant to ward off illness and betrayal. These charms never left his body, even when he slept. And his robes were stitched with hidden pouches containing powders and herbs that he believed could turn fate in his favor. His private chambers were littered with astrological charts, some marked with cryptic notes in his own hand. When critical political decisions arose, Louis would not act until the stars were consulted, leaving ambassadors cooling their heels for days while the heavens decided the fate of kingdoms. In England, long before the Victorian age, King Henry VI exhibited habits that baffled even his closest supporters: gentle, pious, and seemingly detached from the harsh realities of power. Henry had an unusual relationship with ritual and repetition. He would walk the same paths through the palace gardens each day, tracing the same turns and pauses with obsessive precision. If interrupted, he would begin again from the start, as though the act itself was a sacred offering. His speech often took the form of whispered prayers, muttered not to those around him but to an unseen presence. Even in council meetings, he was prone to drift into these murmured conversations, eyes distant, lips moving in patterns known only to him. Some thought it a harmless eccentricity. Others feared it was evidence that the king's mind was slipping away. Far to the east, in the glittering palaces of Siam, King Rama Chulalongkorn was a modernizer and reformer. Yet he too harbored private habits that blurred the line between rational governance and personal superstition. Deeply respectful of Buddhist traditions, he took the unusual step of conducting daily merit-making rituals in solitude, away from the public eye. Each morning before dawn, he would light a specific sequence of candles and arrange offerings in precise patterns. No one was allowed to watch, and those few who glimpsed the ritual claimed it had an almost mathematical order to it, as if the king was calculating balance not only in his spiritual life, but in the destiny of the kingdom itself. He also kept a personal library of rare manuscripts locked away from even his most trusted scholars, insisting that some knowledge was too potent to be handled by others. In Portugal, King João V was famed for his wealth and extravagance. Much of it poured into churches and monasteries, yet his private life contained an unexpected eccentricity. He believed that holy relics could not only bless a realm, but physically protect it. João amassed one of the largest collections of relics in Europe, storing them in specially designed cases made of gold and crystal. But he went further. When illness or political unrest threatened, he would select certain relics to carry on his person, sometimes wearing them under his clothes in specially sewn pockets. Courtiers told of moments when the king, in the midst of an audience, would suddenly reach beneath his robe to touch one of these hidden relics, his fingers lingering as though drawing strength from it. Across the Mediterranean and the kingdom of Morocco, Sultan Moulay Ismail earned a reputation for his staggering number of offspring, hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000. Yet behind the public image of virility was a man ruled by strict, almost obsessive, daily routines. He inspected his stables personally every morning, counting the horses and checking their condition with an intensity usually reserved for generals inspecting troops. Each evening, he would retire to a private room where, according to palace gossip, he kept an intricate map of his entire realm on the floor, updating it with small tokens representing armies, caravans, and ships. These tokens were moved not only based on reports from his commanders, but sometimes according to dreams he claimed were sent to him as divine guidance. His decisions, whether military or domestic, could hinge on the position of a single marker on that map. Finally, in the annals of the Korean Joseon dynasty, King Yongjo stands out for his extreme frugality and micromanagement. Though he ruled for decades, overseeing a time of relative stability, he lived with habits that perplexed those around him. Yongjo would personally inspect palace kitchens, sometimes tasting dishes before they were served, not to savor them, but to ensure no extravagance or waste had occurred. He recorded the number of candles burned in the palace each night and issued reprimands if the count was too high. Yet his most curious practice was his habit of holding invisible councils. He would sit alone in the audience hall, speaking aloud as if addressing ministers, pausing as though listening to responses, and then answering them in turn. These sessions could last hours, and when questioned, he claimed it helped him anticipate every possible argument before real decisions were made. Across continents and centuries, these kings shared little in common in their politics, faiths, or fortunes, but in their private worlds, they were united by the strangeness of human nature. Each crown sat atop a mind both brilliant and burdened, where superstition, obsession, and compulsion intertwined with the machinery of power. For some, these habits offered comfort or control in a life defined by uncertainty. For others, they became cages of their own making, narrowing their worlds until only ritual remained. History tends to polish its monarchs into symbols: hero, tyrant, reformer, conqueror, but the truth is always more complicated. Behind the banners and proclamations, each was a man with habits as fragile and irrational as those of any subject, only magnified by the isolation of absolute rule. And in those strange, secret patterns of daily life, we glimpse not just their eccentricities, but the shadows they cast over their reigns. The past is littered with such stories, tales not found in the clean lines of official chronicles, but in the whispered accounts of servants, the private letters, and the odd artifact left behind in dusty archives. They remind us that power does not erase the human need for ritual, comfort, and control it only distorts it, often into forms too strange for common life. And in the end, these habits, no matter how bizarre, are as much a part of their legacy as any law or battle. So as we step back from these hidden chambers, leaving behind the relics, the locked cabinets, the fur-lined walls, and the ghostly councils, remember this: the strangest truths are often the ones never meant to be seen. The kings of history ruled their people in daylight, but in darkness, they ruled themselves, and sometimes they lost. If you wish to keep walking deeper into these shadows, where history is not clean but raw, not polished but unsettling, then stay close to the flame. Subscribe to the channel, where every story takes you beyond the gilded surface and into the eerie heart of the past. The throne may be empty now, the halls long silent, but the habits of kings echo still. If you dare to listen,